privilege to have Sir Gus involved today. And Craig, you're absolutely trying to summarise Sir Gus's CV would be impossible to take the rest of the seminar. It's a stellar CV, so great privilege to have you along, Gus. And colleagues, Sir Gus is going to talk about the most topical subject of all, leading through crisis, lessons from the government's handling of the coronavirus situation. And the usual format, 10, 15 minutes or so of our guest speaker. If you could try put your questions into chat, and I will do my level best to follow them and bring you in at the end of Sir Gus's talk so that we can turn it into the Q&A. So over to you, Sir Gus, and welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm fortunate, and it's a great pleasure to be here with such an interesting group who are all doing amazing work from the introduction that Craig gave me about what you all do. So first of all, thank you for everything you're doing, and God, you're needed at the minute. So let me talk about leadership in crises. And unfortunately, I have an enormous amount of experience in crises. When I came back from one particular spell in Washington, it was because there was a crisis in the Treasury, and Nigel Lawson was then Chancellor, and he'd fallen out with Margaret Thatcher, and he wanted me to be his press secretary for some obscure reason. And I did that so brilliantly that within a few weeks, Nigel Lawson had resigned, and that was leading up to the end of Margaret Thatcher. I then became John Major's press secretary, went through things like Black Wednesday, which was a wonderful triumph for all concerned. But more recently, I'd say some of the health crises and some of the global financial crises with Gordon Brown as Prime Minister are very much embedded on my mind. And it's worth thinking about how people led through those crises. I'll particularly think about the global financial crisis and what we can learn from that. And what's different about this one. So when you look at the global financial crisis, first of all, it started in that nasty country, America, whereas, you know, we could have called it the American financial crisis, really, because it started with subprime there, but spread very rapidly around the world. And it was, if you like, one sector, namely the financial sector, which created problems for virtually the rest of us. And in terms of trying to solve that crisis, you needed to sort out the financial sector and thereby sort out, the foundations of our economy. And you needed to work in a global way because this was a global crisis. If you look at the differences with this crisis, with the corona crisis, first of all, actually, there's one sense in which people don't realize it's a lot easier to lead through. Let me explain what I mean by that. First of all, as a prime minister, you are trying to bring the country together at a time of crisis, number one, right? And that normally involves, you mentioned Churchill during the war. It's easy when you've got a common enemy. And Second World War is quite clear. Germany, Hitler, common enemy. You take the global financial crisis, well, to say that all of your banks are the common enemy is, somewhat divisive, but, there were real problems. The thing about the coronavirus is it's absolutely clear. There is one common enemy. We've all got it around the world, same enemy. Let's all come together and do it. And it's a time for you to bring the nation together. So it's actually a great opportunity for a leader to bring the nation together and to say, look, we're going to struggle with this. There's going to be really tough times, but eventually we're going to come through. And that will be true of this crisis. Believe me, there will come a moment when we either have a vaccine or treatments or a combination thereof where we will have come through it. It will take a long time. I think, the idea that this will be over by Christmas is now just history. This will take many, many months. It will be hard, but you can imagine coming through it. And when you've come through it, you're able to say, wasn't it wonderful? We all worked together and all the rest of it. But that does require you to, first of all, handle the crisis efficiently and competently. And I'm afraid at the moment we are doing neither. If you look at the kind of nature of how you get hold of a crisis as a leader, first of all, you need to understand it. you need to get the right data. That was where we went wrong, first of all. If you look at where the reliable data comes from now, and I'd strongly recommend you only to look at this, mostly to look at this data, is the Office for National Statistics, the ONS random sampling data. That is the kind of golden form of data. It actually tells you a lot about what's going on. It's the most informative. Nearly all of the other stuff, you know, looking at cases every day when the number of tests changes all the time. I mean, just can't believe how many statistical errors have gone wrong. And one of my trustees on pro bono economics, Ed Humperson, is with the Director of Regulation of the Official Statistics Regulator, has had to write to the government to say, you are misusing statistics. So there's all sorts of things gone wrong there. Secondly, unlike the global financial crisis, this is a crisis which, although it's a health crisis to start with, all of the tools you're using, I mean, you've got a set of health tools, which are better treatments, all those sorts of things, eventually a vaccine. But in the short run, your tools are lockdowns of various kinds, which are basically economic tools and create economic damage, closing schools, closing all the rest of it. So all along, you are creating trade-offs, right? And the idea there's no trade-offs in all of this is a bit of a joke, right? Because when you know, what I would have asked for from my medics at the start is, give me all of these restriction possibilities, closing pubs at 10, closing them completely, restaurants, all of the different things, and tell me about what their impact on transmission of the disease is. And then I want our social scientists to tell me what the impact on the economy, on social life, and all the rest of it would be. So things like closing schools, tell me how that works through. So it's all basically a cost benefit and sense of trade-offs. We've ducked those issues. We have a SAGE which is completely, well, virtually entirely dominated by medics, which means that they put forward ideas which are designed mostly to reduce the direct impacts of COVID, right? Which is a very small part of the impact on all of us, of what's going on. Because you've got the direct impact of COVID on deaths and serious illnesses. You've got the indirect effects on health of things that aren't being done because we've redirected resources away. And then you've got the impact on the economy, on unemployment, on loneliness and well-being. What this government has achieved, which I've spelt out in a lecture I gave to the Institute of Fiscal Studies, is an amazing trio of outcomes. We have one of the worst levels of excess deaths in the world per unit of population. Secondly, we've got one of the biggest impacts on our economy. And thirdly, and this for me is by far the most important, the biggest drop in the well-being of the population. We now, thank goodness, are able to measure that quite well by looking at the ONS questions on subjective well-being. And believe me, people's overall satisfaction with their life has fallen dramatically in the UK. Not surprisingly, really, it actually went up a bit when the first lockdown came because of the certainty, but it's fallen off quite dramatically since. So we are failing on outcome measures, and this is really about leadership, about bringing the right data together, the right processes, and then, of course, you have to understand the fact that these crises are global. Now, when it came to the global financial crisis, and this is where I always think of that picture of the Nightingale Hospital in London, that is the Excel Centre. The Excel Centre was where Gordon Brown brought all of the leaders of the world, the G20, President Obama and all the other people together to say, look, we're in this together. We mustn't go down the route of protectionism. We mustn't repeat the mistakes that were made in the Depression in the 30s in the US. We must work together. And we are going to need that. Believe me, we are going to need that. When this vaccine comes through, if it comes through, and I'm really hopeful it will, we're going to have to sort out who gets it first. And if you leave that to the market, it'll be the people who can afford it. Would it not be much better if it was to the people who need it most, who went first? That will require a big global effort. Nobody's really thinking about that yet. Nobody's thinking about paving the way to make sure that when we get this vaccine, the phrase I've always used is a vaccine is not vaccination. Getting people vaccinated is a far bigger problem than just having a vaccine. So we need to be thinking about that now. That brings us into the other part of the leadership thing, which is the whole behavioral stuff. We are trying to change people's behavior. And that requires you to have lots of behavioral scientists in there as well. So I think we've had this problem of an imbalance in the intellectual disciplines, a problem of leadership, because let's face it, this cabinet was chosen really to deliver the right answers on Brexit. I'm actually, one of the bright lights of all this is that I'm quite confident that we will not have a no deal Brexit, because I think even this Prime Minister and this Chancellor, who I think has done very well during this pandemic, will realise that actually adding to the woes of the economy and business and potential unemployment by having a no-deal Brexit would be absolutely disastrous. So I expect there to be a deal. I expect French to be completely French, by which I mean they'll fight for a very long time, well past the closing bell, and probably it'll be about fishing. And we'll see the usual thing that we do in EU crises. It'll just carry on and on and on. So I don't want to overdo my time, but just one thing to say in this, or two final points. One is the role of the civil service in all this. It's been very tricky. Civil service is required to be impartial. It's required to try and speak truth unto power. I think that's been quite hard, the way things have been set up. We've seen the exits of a number of permanent secretaries, including the cabinet secretary. And we've seen the growth of special advisors like Dominic Cummings. I'm someone who thinks that good special advisors are massively useful for governments, both for the ministers and for the civil service. I remember working, for example, with people across the political spectrum, Rupert Harrison for the Conservatives, Ed Balls, Ed Miliband for Labour, as special advisors. Brilliant, actually helped a lot. There were some very, very good Lib Dem special advisors as well. So I'm not against special advisors. I am against special advisors who basically want to clone themselves and want to hire people who are just like them. This is the reverse of what you need, which is diversity of opinion, stop groupthink, have people who think outside the role. Final point about the role of charities. I think during this period, it has been an incredibly tough time for charities. The demands upon you have increased quite substantially, and your ability to deal with them has obviously gone down because of financial issues. I completely get that. I think we're all very aware of that. And your ability to deliver in the way you'd like to. My wife is a volunteer for Citizens Advice Bureau, and the absence of being able to meet people face to face is a real drawback, because it's so much harder for the kinds of things that all of you on this call are dealing with. To do them via Zoom or whatever is just, or by phone, is much, much more difficult, particularly if people have language issues. So I think you're doing a great job. I think we need to think very carefully about this. And this is my one final plug, Craig. Pro bono economics. We've got the Law Family Commission on the civil society, where partly coming out of a conversation I had with Andy Haldane, the Bank of England's Chief Economic Advisor, on what should charities really do? What should government do? And why is it that when we think about, and I'm totally guilty of this, when I was an economics lecturer, when you talk about economics, you talk about the public sector and the private sector. And that's basically it. And if people talk about the third sector, they even use that language, the third sector. It's some kind of residual. And it's not, right? It has a particular role. There are things that the civil society, the social sector, whatever you want to call it, do much, much better than both the private sector and the government sector. And we need to sort out how we help charities do that and maximize their impact and are funded in the right ways. So enough from me. I will shut up now and pass on to Brendan, who's going to pretend to be, I'm not sure whether it's going to be Nick Robinson or or something worse.
I'm going to be facilitator more than inquisitor.